Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight for our program Wyandotte in Kansas, The Past is Prologue to Redlining. This event is a partnership between Johnson County Community College, Kansas Studies Institute, and the Kansas City, Kansas Public Library. My name is Ann Lacey, and I am the Kansas Collection Librarian at the Kansas City, Kansas Public Library. The conversation we'll be having this evening is in preparation for the exhibit coming up in 2022 at the Johnson County Museum on the history of redlining in Kansas City. We will be hearing from Dr. Ty Edwards and John Nichols on the history of the Wyandotte people, their removal to Kansas, and the historical effects of their experiences. After the discussion, there will be time for questions from the audience. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Ty Edwards is an associate professor of history and director of Johnson County Community College's Kansas Studies Institute. Dr. Edwards' research interests include North American colonization, U.S. imperialism, indigenous peoples, gender, and environmental history. She's written on Osage history, including her book, Osage Women and Empire, Gender and Power, which examines how Osage gender complementarity was central to the rise of an Osage empire in the 18th century and in resisting U.S. colonization in the 19th century. She has received awards for her teaching and writing, including Johnson County Community College's BNSF Railway Faculty Achievement Award, College Scholar Award, and a Publication Award. And John Nichols received his master's in history from the University of Kansas. He's the former archivist, curator, and interim director of the Wyandotte County Museum in Bonner Springs. He is the Wyandotte Nation of Kansas archivist and is an adopted member of the Wyandotte Nation of Kansas. And he currently works for Douglas County. I'm so glad we could be together tonight. And Ty, I will now turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you all for joining us. I'm so excited to be here with John. Thank you so much, John, for joining us. I haven't actually gotten to see John in person since the pandemic, so it's so nice to be in a room with you.
Thank you both, and thank you all for being here.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to just get started. And again, remember, as Anne said, you can ask questions when we get to the end if there's things you'd like to know more about. All right, so John, tell us about Wyandotte life in the early United States before they were forced to move to what we now call Kansas.
For the Wyandotte, well, originally they started off in Canada and were tied to the French. And as a result of the French and Indian Wars and ultimately Revolutionary War, part of what happens is that they wind up being tied to essentially the losing side there. They wind up eventually going ahead and retreating under Iroquois attacks into both Ohio and over into Michigan. And the ones in the Wyandotte who are in Ohio tend to support the Americans during the Revolution as well as the War of 1812. And the ones who are over by Detroit tend to be a little bit more supportive of the English, partly because by that point it's become kind of a stronghold for the English.
Sure.
So lots of nastiness going on and actually division within the tribe itself.
Right.
So eventually under the Iroquois attacks, like I said, they wind up in those two locations. And things really are, there's a lot of intermarriage with the Europeans. So that's something that should be fairly calm, but not necessarily.
Sure.
You wind up with intermarriage with African Americans too. And one of the things that you've got going on is you're going from a communal tribal or a communal landholding process, and they're starting to look at, particularly as Ohio Territory opens up, the Northwest Territory, you're starting to go, wait a minute, we're supposed to have this land forever, and suddenly here we go again.
Right.
In the case of the Wyandotte in Ohio, you have a stone grist mill, stone church, Brick, frame, stone, and log houses, barns, outbuildings. It's essentially, and you've got fenced crops. So you've essentially got what looks like a European settlement.
Right.
And by this point, the pressure is on. After 1830, everything is trying to move any indigenous people west and out of the, quote, desirable settlement areas.
Totally.
So you go ahead and start forcing the people out. There were several attempts to go ahead and get the Wyandot to move out here. And the first two were both failures. The final straw, though, came when there was a family that was fairly prominent within Wyandot tribal culture, murdered. Everyone, including the white authorities, knew who the murderers were. They refused to prosecute. And at that point, the decision was, we know that one way or another, if we don't leave, we'll die here.
Right.
And so, at least this way, we will be able to continue. Our children will have a life.
Right.
We have something to look forward to.
Right. So when we talk about the Ohio Wyandots, tell us a little bit more about the role of African Americans in the community in Ohio.
You had actually a couple of things going on, because with Ohio, one of the things that people forget is you've got Kentucky and at that point Virginia, both of which are slaveholding territories. So the Wyandot believed that it was morally wrong that you judged an individual by his personal worth. What does he do for the community? That's what's important,
Sure.
not the color of the skin. And as part of the Freedom Seekers started to head north into Ohio, the Wyandot went ahead and were involved in the Underground Railroad there because part of it took them straight through their territory. The other thing is there actually were several villages, or towns if you want to call them that were within Wyandot lands of escaped slaves. So with that element going on, for the Freedom Seekers, they knew this was a safe place. And that attitude would carry on predominantly even as far as coming west into Kansas. So you've still got the Underground Railroad activity out here.
Awesome. All right. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to Quindaro in a second. Okay, so you've kind of led up to this. So the Wyandot leave Ohio. It seems like you're talking because of pressure from Americans. And the way I usually teach that with my students is that removal is connected to Indian policy, right?
Exactly.
So Indian policy in the United States was highly connected to what scholars call settler colonialism.
Right.
Right? So there's lots of different kinds of empires and lots of different kinds of colonies, but the United States and the British North American colonies before them were what we call settler colonies.
Right.
And so that's where the settler empire wants to possess that land for its own people, right? Its own settlers. And therefore, indigenous people, in the context of the empire, the indigenous people have to be eliminated.
One way or another, exactly.
Right. So when you talk about like the violence towards the Wyandots, I think about that as sort of acts of terrorism or acts of violence to, encourage that movement. And so when we talk about Indian removal policy, a lot of scholars call that ethnic cleansing policy, right? Because it's expelling
Right.
all of the indigenous people east of the Mississippi River to west. And I always think of the Wyandots are a great example because, as you point out, they have, American-style homes. They wear American-style clothes. Many of them are Christians, right? And many of them have professions. And so it doesn't matter what assimilation programs or assimilation tactics you've engaged in, right? From an American perspective, you are indigenous.
Right.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about what that removal experience and that forced expulsion experience is like for the Wyandots.
Well, for the Wyandot, basically they wound up gathering predominantly towards the church there in Sandusky. And they have a repeat of the preaching of the funeral service for the missionary who brought them the gospel, or actually I should say the Protestant missionary who brought them the gospel. His name was John Stewart, and he was indigenous, European, and African American, all three. First missionary established by the Methodist Church in the United States, and highly respected within, well, enough so that they've had him buried there in the cemetery with the members of the tribe. They went ahead, re-preached that, and then proceeded to go ahead and prepare to leave. When they were leaving, they were going to be taken out by steamboat. There were 3 places where they were supposed to be making payments on the way, and the first payment goes off fine, no problems.
Meaning payments from the U.S. government?
Payments to the steamboat operators.
Oh, okay.
But this is where life gets interesting. Like I said, first payment, fine. And at that point, the operator of the Nottoway, which is one of the steamboats, proceeds to go ahead and decide that he doesn't really trust these people, so he proceeds to go ahead, strip all the carpets and furnishings, and basically puts them on short rations.
Wow.
And pretty much does a nasty job with it on the way down. One of the other problems is that when they stopped in Cincinnati on the way, a lot of people came to see them because these are the last Indians who are leaving Ohio. This is the end. And one of the families, depending on who you talk to, had either measles or smallpox. So by the time they're on board the boat, it's spreading. They wind up getting out to the Kansas Territory, or what becomes Kansas, thinking that they've already got their land purchased from the Shawnee. And instead, they get out here, find out that the Indian agent for the Shawnee has basically torpedoed the plan, so they don't have any place to go. The place where they are dumped, literally, because there's a heavy rain coming in, it's the middle of summer, it's hot, and they get dumped in the bottoms, which is not a real great place to be if you have no shelter. And there was no shelter, no food, no money to go ahead and buy any of the above. If you didn't have money set by before you came out, and there were a few families who did, and they were able to go ahead and rent rooms in Westport briefly. But they originally requested to the steamboat captain, would you please at least let us stay on board overnight? No, off the boat.
Right.
And as soon as they were off the boat, they could see them going ahead and starting to go ahead and replace everything that they had taken down. So it's sort of like adding insult to injury.
Right. Right.
By the time they get out here, well, within a matter of months, you've lost 1/10 of the tribe, thanks to the disease. Still don't have any place to live.
Right.
And ultimately, the Delaware, who they had helped out back in Ohio, go ahead and are prevailed upon to at least get them someplace where they can bury the dead. And that's the start of what becomes Huron Cemetery.
Okay.
Eventually, the Delaware do go ahead and sell them land, and that's how you wind up with what's called the Wyandotte Purchase, if you look at the old maps.
Right. So whenever I teach about removal, like you're talking about, you know, students are usually familiar with the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but what they don't know is that every forcibly removed nation has this story of death, like you're talking about. So the Wyandotte story is very typical of other natives, right? With disruption to, right, personal life, personal property, spiritual life, community, and then we have disease, and then we also have homelessness and malnutrition, right?
Right.
So you can't plant and harvest crops the year you're in the community where you're leaving or in the community where you're going because the timing is so disrupted.
Right.
Right. So I think about that Wyandotte story is both tragic but also widely repeated amongst a lot of indigenous nations.
It is.
Yeah. Forced to move to Kansas and to other places.
Right. It didn't matter whether it was Kansas, Arkansas, Missouri, wherever.
Right.
It was the same story over and over and over and over.
Yes, exactly. All right, so tell us about what was Wyandotte life like in Kansas once they're here?
Well, they get here in 1843, just as everything is about to cut loose. You've got the Great Awakening going on within the Protestant churches, and you have a split that's developing. You have most of the mission conferences that are passed over to the southern branches of the churches, and then you have the northern branches. In the case of the Wyandotte, when they were in Ohio, before they ever came out here, they had established a constitution that basically said, we abhor slavery, and we will not tolerate it. With the church being assigned, with the mission church being assigned to the ME Church South, that sets up the dynamics for more separation and more schisms within the tribe, because you've got one branch that is adamantly opposed, and ultimately they wind up sort of becoming the core for what will eventually become Quindaro. You have the other group, which, while they may not necessarily be pro-slavery, they are not as willing to rock the boat at that moment.
Right.
So this is 1843 to 44. Meanwhile, things are starting to develop elsewhere. You've got the Mexican-American War, for instance.
Right.
And what people forget is that one of the reasons for that war is to expand the opportunity for slavery. That's part of the reason why you have Thoreau refusing to pay taxes back east, because he says, I will not support this war. And it's popular in the South and somewhat in the Northwest, because they're going, hey, more free land maybe. But as far as back east itself and in the North, no. So you've got that going on. Meanwhile, this is 1848. We're talking 5 years after they've been pushed out. Still no payment.
And payment from who for what?
Payment from the United States government for the land and improvements in Ohio and Michigan.
Right.
One of the things that happens is the War Department is in charge of the Indian Affairs. At that time, 1843, they allocate $20,000 for everything. Ohio, all the improvements, Michigan, improvements, everything. Hey, not a problem. Well, remember I mentioned that they had frame, brick, stone, all of these different things?
Yep.
What you wind up with is people inside the tribe who are savvy enough that they say, that's way too low, so they hire independent fee appraisers to come in, and they come back with a figure that says, well, actually, if you're looking at fair market value, you're looking more like $125,000.
Right.
Army's response immediately is, wait a minute. These are Indians. They can't do this. But with the itemized list, it showed that, yes, there actually was something to this. The next problem then becomes, that's $100,000 more plus than we had allocated. Where are we going to get the money? Eventually, there is a settlement, but the United States is slow on paying, like over 140 years slow. The final payments are in the 1980s. So that's,
Right.
Try doing that with the other way around.
Right. So they don't have that money then to help
No.
rebuild
No.
when they're in Kansas.
No. And in fact, you're having to start from scratch, basically, because you're dealing with an area that hadn't been the land that they settled upon, which had been Delaware. A lot of it hadn't even been cleared.
Right.
So now you have to clear the land. You have to go ahead and start building with log because that's what you got handy.
Correct.
Then you go ahead and start trying to develop clearing for crops and rebuilding that sense of community.
Right. And this is part of why removal is so devastating, right? It's not just the movement, right? It's the lack of infrastructure. It's the lack of payment for your previous property. All of that makes it hard to build your new home.
Well, particularly when whoever controls the land actually controls your ability to sustain your own life. Because until you have the ability to get some of the necessities that you need, you're going to be very hard pressed just to survive.
Right, right. And that contributes to some of the things you were talking about, like the factionalism that's
Right.
a problem for the Wyandottes. So not only are they sort of faced with these challenges that are external, but they're struggling to know how to
Well, and
make ends meet, right?
making ends meet, and the other thing is, how do we fit in? Because on one side we have the Delaware, but if you go across the river, or in this case rivers, because you're dealing with the Missouri River on the north, Kansas River on the south, and then cutting in on the east side, you're dealing with Missouri. And one of the things that is going on in Missouri is that they have just gotten rid of the Osage.
Right,
So they've already pushed them west.
correct.
Meanwhile, they've actually just gotten done pushing out the Mormons.
True.
So
Yeah.
you've had two military conflicts right there, just boom, boom.
Right,
Now you've got the Mexican War going on. But right before the Mexican War starts, there's a fellow named William Walker who sort of blows the lid off of how things are going to be handled in the future. Part of the reason why is because Walker is a descendant. In fact, his father had been a captive who was captured by the Delaware, wound up being ransomed by the Wyandot, and eventually wound up marrying into the tribe. And then you've got William and his brothers and sisters along the way that are still influenced at least a little bit because Daddy had come from Virginia, where slavery was an accepted fact. Out here, William is hanging out with people like Benjamin Stringfellow and David Rice Atchison, who are two prominent politicians, both in the pro-slavery camp.
right.
And 1847, he goes down to Harrisonville, Missouri, winds up coming back with Dorcas, a 32-year-old black slave,
To the Wyandotte.
to the Wyandotte Reserve.
Right.
And the Wyandottes are not happy. And he has also served in the capacity as chief at one point and is trusted by the U.S. government.
Right.
So you've got all of these layers of confusion. Meanwhile, you're still waiting for payment. You're still trying to figure out, okay, because people forget too that in this country, if you are indigenous, you do not have the ability to buy or sell land without approval from the United States Congress and or the United States President.
Right.
So that means that anybody who purchases land, it has to go through government hands, which means that they control the funding, and you may or may not ever see it.
Right.
So Walker is one of the ones who starts looking at, okay, what can we do to change this so that we can at least buy and sell land? Well, the decision in Washington is, well, you can't be indigenous.
Right.
So at that point, they start looking, well, okay, then what do we do? Establish a territory, and then at that point, if we get a territory established, then we can start looking into making you citizens.
Right.
Now, 1853, you've got an election that's held for the provisional territory of Nebraska. Idea being, if we're looking at everything west of the Missouri state line and Iowa state line, the southern portion is connected strongly to Missouri, so Missourians will come in.
Right.
The folks on the northern side, Iowa's a free state, so balance of power, no problem.
Right.
This keeps everything flowing. Part that's interesting is if you look at the people who are voting in the election. For one thing, you have indigenous population, which technically by law can't vote in this country until 1924.
Right.
You also have got military officers, and in this area, most of them are going to be up at Fort Leavenworth and are from the South. And if you look further north, again, you're looking at folks who are going to be missionaries, traders, folks who have a vested interest in seeing this territory open up. Walker winds up getting himself elected as governor of the Provisional Territory of Nebraska. All the evidence based off of the returns from this election are everything south of the state line is going to go ahead, and what's next to Missouri will indeed go pro-slavery. What's north will go ahead and be free state. So again, balance of power, no problem.
Right.
Based off of that, Atchison, Stringfellow, and their friend Douglas wind up going ahead and helping decide, let's go for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We'll open up the territory and we'll let the folks there decide.
Right.
You all know how that turned out.
Well, so how did this lead to the founding of Quindaro? And how does all of this connect to the Wyandotte relationship to Quindaro?
Part of what's going on is you've got Wyandotte City, which is considered pro-slavery because of its connection to the Walker family. And the Walker family's pretty firmly entrenched. You've got the ME Church South there, so it's reasonable. Certainly for somebody who knows what Walker's past is. Meanwhile, you have the territory opening up. You have no free state ports in the territory. Right. Everything is going to be stopped and searched. Initially, that's not a problem. When the first election is held, if you look at numbers of people on the ground in Kansas, Kansas would have come in as a pro-slave state. But
right.
Voter fraud,
right.
When you've got more than twice as many voters as you do people who are actually residents, that tends to raise some red flags,
right.
Not to mention a whole lot of hackles.
Totally.
And at that point, the New Englanders got very busy, and you start seeing the development of the New England Immigrant Aid Company and societies.
Sure.
So they start looking at getting as many people out here, boots on the ground, as they can to counter.
Right.
Now, like I said, Wyandotte's considered pro-slavery. Meanwhile, you've got Quindaro, which you've got the abolitionist or ME North Church sitting up off Parallel Avenue.
Right.
And down the hillside is where you've got a natural rock port. So you've got a natural landing for steamboats. If you're looking at transporting people and equipment and supplies in, this is the one place where you can take them, which will not be subject to search and seizure. But first we have to get the land. And the land is in the allotments of, land is in the allotments of a number of Wyandotte families.
So how did the Wyandottes end up with allotments?
Though the allotments, that one comes out of the 1855.
Okay.
Thank you. Because in 1855, there is a treaty that is very interesting. The voting is extremely short-lived
By the Wyandottes?
by the Wyandottes
Okay.
to approve this treaty. There are a number of names who show up as applying for citizenship who didn't necessarily apply
Is citizenship as Wyandottes or as Americans?
as Americans.
Ah,
Because under the terms of this treaty, the Wyandotte Nation will cease to exist. They will no longer be Indian. Instead, suddenly they will become United States citizens. They'll be subject to getting land in fee simple title in legal terms, which means I can buy and sell to whoever,
sure.
and I get the cash.
Right.
So you have these allotments that are being carved up, and you have the one class that are classified as the competence or the citizen band, and then you have the others who may apply for temporary exemption or may be judged as not appropriate for these benefits yet. This also allows for the appointment of guardians for those allotments, which means that the guardians then can go ahead and sell.
Right. Yeah.
And so you wind up with, instead of a Wyandotte reserve, suddenly you're chunking it up into individual allotments for families
Right.
and family members. And as a result of the efforts predominantly of Abelard Guthrie, who had been a land agent back in Ohio, was an abolitionist, and had married into the tribe, you wind up with him working together with agents who initially are supposed to be part of the New England Immigrant Aid Company, and then they find out a little bit afterwards that there are still connections to the New England Immigrant Aid Company, definitely, but they're no longer employed by them as they had sort of billed themselves. So you wind up with that going on, but in the meantime, they've already made arrangements to go ahead and purchase a number of these allotments and the acreage to go with it to develop this town site.
And that's what becomes Quindaro.
And that's what becomes Quindaro.
Right.
So you wind up with Quindaro getting a lot of Eastern money, a lot of interest. In fact, the part that still kind of blows my mind is you've got reports in the London Times with Crimean War material at the same time that further down the page you have reports from Kansas.
Right.
Which is kind of mind-boggling.
Right. And how central it was, you mean, to national news.
And international.
Yeah.
Because that's the London Times.
Right, right.
So it's really strange, but they're definitely watching, and they're also doing some investing of their own. So you've got these different things going on.
And tell everybody a little bit more about the Wyandottes might have been, willing might be the wrong word, right? They felt compelled to take allotments because they thought that could help them accomplish what?
Well, at that point, they are hoping that as individual landholders, maybe this time we'll get to stay.
Right.
Because having been chased all the way from Canada into Ohio, and then from Ohio being forced into Kansas, there's always the sense of longing, of missing home, because you can build a community, but then if you have to destroy it and relocate, it's traumatic for everybody. and that trauma lasts for generations.
Right.
So you don't just automatically decide I'm going to pack up, I'm going to move, and then I'm ready to move on again. By the time you've been here for 12 years, at least, you're starting to look at what can I do to make this work so that I can stay this time, so that my children will be able to have a stable future. We don't have to worry about coming under attack.
Right, right. So who came to live in Quindaro and why did it bust?
Quindaro is a combination of a lot of folks from New England and the Northeast. You still have Wyandotte families that are living there. And you also increasingly are having freedom seekers or escaped slaves coming across the Missouri River. And one of the things that's interesting is in 1859, there's a municipal election, a city election. The election judges know that this individual is a freedom seeker. They let him vote in the municipal election.
Subversive.
Subversive, and also quite possibly one of the first, certainly the first in the Kansas Territory.
Right, true.
Causes outrage in Wyandotte City, and their response is to demand that that vote be removed. Well,
it wasn't that close, I bet.
It wasn't, and the other part of it was that, at that point, you've already got the ballots all being counted, so how do you decide which one is his?
Right, totally. Totally.
But you have all three groups that are starting to settle in the area. That's not to say that you're not under threat, because with 1850, you had the fugitive slave law, which means that there were periodically slave catchers from Missouri that would come over, and they would hang out around Quindaro Park, and we know that there were instances where they tried kidnapping freed African Americans and forcing them into slavery. But one of the things that's also interesting about what happens is you've got other Free State towns that are being burned. Case in point, Lawrence.
Yes.
You got Lawrence, you got a number of others that are under attack, Osawatomie. Quindaro's never attacked. And part of the reason for that, the belief is that a certain amount of how to put this mildly, there was a certain amount of protection that was granted by who was chosen as president of the Quindaro Town Company. William Walker's brother Joel. Now, that has since been looked upon by some historians as proof that Quindaro really wasn't abolitionist at all. It was just purely speculative.
Right. An economic prospect.
Just economic.
Right.
The Wyandotte, though, had a tendency of, they were pretty astute politically. And it was not uncommon for them to develop paired towns anyway. So this actually fit the pattern. But by going ahead and having a vested interest of the Walker family, even the folks who are pro-slavery are going to be less likely to go after it in that sense. Another factor is it's not real easy to access except by river.
Right.
And Quindaro has kind of an ace up its sleeve, so to speak, and that's Lazarus.
Explain that.
Lazarus is a cannon that the town site had acquired. And when the pro-slavers would come in, it would tend to get buried. And then when they left, like Lazarus, back from the grave.
Right.
The other thing that they did was they sort of used it as a thumb in the eye to the pro-slavery people for because whenever the steamboats would land, they'd go ahead and fire a blank load just to let them know, A, we've got
It
the
works.
cannon, and
Yeah.
B, here come more people.
Right.
In terms of why it failed,
Right.
there were a couple of things that conspired. 1858 is really when it's starting to get a good boost. And 1859, you have a major crash that starts off in the East and basically goes worldwide. So the money that has been coming in to develop is drying up. It's gone. 1859 also is nasty because from 59 to 60, you have a year where there's no rain, no snow, nothing. It's drought. It's bad enough that the settlers in Kansas are sending requests for relief back east, whether it's for food, seed, clothing, blankets, anything that you can spare. So you've got that going on. Kansas is still a territory, so in a sense you're still safe there until January 1861. And then everything changes again. Because at that point, again, just on the other side of the river is Missouri. From the Quindaro Bluffs, we know that one of the Presbyterian minister up there, whenever he wanted to talk to his counterpart over in Parkville during the territorial period, he would hang out a white sheet, and vice versa. And they could actually determine this.
Mm-hmm.
So you're close enough that with a glass, you can actually see.
Right.
As Kansas becomes a free state, suddenly Confederate flags start popping up in Parkville. And that's a little troubling. Remember too, the year before, the river hasn't really, it's only been going down.
Right.
In 61, they said that the river actually froze solid enough that parties of horsemen could cross back and forth without using a ferry, without using a bridge. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, you're on the front line, and you are at somebody else's mercy yet again.
Right.
Part of the men are joining the Union Army. Mm-hmm. Part of the families are looking at trying to find someplace safe to go, which often means trying to get back to wherever you had come from.
Right.
You know, you're going back to family members that you can stay with, at least for the duration.
Right.
And most of the population that's left at that point are women, children, and old folks. Right. They request a federal presence. So they ask the Kansas government to provide Kansas troops. Mm-hmm. Well, they get them. Elements of the 9th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry show up, and it is a bitter winter,
right.
Obviously. The commanding officer basically says, all right, stable your horses in any unoccupied buildings. Doesn't matter if it's a house, a hotel, doesn't matter, warehouse, get them in there. And since we don't want you going too far afield to go ahead and look for firewood, you know, once you've gathered up what's really close in, feel free to go ahead and take the doors off the hinges, right. Etc.
Right.
You can go ahead and take the window frames, mm-hmm. take the mantles away from the fireplaces.
Right.
In short, what you're doing is rendering the place
unlivable.
Yeah. And in fact, it doesn't take them long before they go ahead, and they being the people of Quindaro that are left, they go ahead and say, look, we thought we were in danger from the Confederates across the river, but no. These guys are worse.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's a great spot for us to sort of segue into the questions that you have from the audience, Anne. So thank you, John, for giving us so much of the Wyandotte experience, right? From the Canadian spot to Quindaro. So Anne, do you have some questions from our audience members?
I do. One of the questions is, you mentioned that arrangements with the Shawnee were torpedoed by the Shawnee Indian agents.
Right.
Can you say a bit about why these agents existed, their role, and how this particular agent ruined the plans? Why did he do it? Did he have a personal interest in wrecking the deal?
Good. Those are very good questions, because part of what happens, the Indian agent is assigned by the United States government. Oftentimes it was a missionary too. So you sort of, you're getting double duty there. One of the things that this particular individual took exception to was that part of the Shawnee lands that they were looking at included what would be part of Johnson County, as well as some of the lands over across the line in the vicinity of Westport initially. The Wyandotte, like I said, had a reputation for being anti-slavery, and one of the things that's going on with the government appointees is the vast majority of them are being appointed by a political administration that is looking at when Kansas does eventually wind up becoming part of the United States. They're looking at it becoming a pro-slave settlement. And the idea that you would have a bunch of people involved with the Underground Railroad right in the middle of it, that's not a good thing. The other thing is that, from what I remember, there was a certain vested interest that he had. So, yeah, he worked together with Congress. The agent.
Yeah, right.
He worked together with Congress to go ahead and torpedo that, to sink the deal.
That's good.
So we have another question. What happened to Dorcas? Did William Walker's views on slavery change?
That is a good question. Dorcas does wind up continuing to live with the family. And as far as what really happens with her, I don't have a good, solid answer. It's my understanding that she did stay with the family throughout and eventually wound up, being freed. But when you don't have any place else to go, it's not uncommon for someone to go ahead and stay where at least you know you have a roof over your head.
That's right, yeah.
Sorry, I don't have more details.
Another question. How long did the Wyandotte stay in Quindaro after the town died out? Or did they stay on their allotted lands, or did they sell off that land?
Some of the Wyandotte did stay on their allotted land, at least until 1862. And under the terms of the Treaty of 1855, no Indian lands were to be taxed until 5 years after statehood. Okay, Kansas becomes a state in 1861, which means that nobody should have to pay taxes on their land. No Wyandotte, Shawnee, Delaware should have to pay taxes on their allotment until 1866. By 1862, Wyandotte County and the state of Kansas are selling off land at sheriff sales for back taxes in direct violation of the treaty.
So that's how a lot of Wyandottes lose their land in Quindaro and in other parts of Kansas. Yeah.
And the other thing is, even if they did retain ownership, they may come back and find that suddenly somebody else is living in the property.
Right.
And nobody's going to move to get them out.
Right. Another classic part of settler colonialism is squatting on indigenous land.
Right.
To make it yours. Yeah. Really quickly, before we get to the next question, Anne, I wanted to talk a little bit about redlining while we have a few minutes. So, of course, this is a preview to the Johnson County Museum's
Right.
redlining exhibit. So, when I think about redlining, when I'm teaching with my students, I talk about late 19th century segregation and I talk about 20th century redlining. And when I think about those, I think about different competitions in economic systems. I think about trying to prevent political alliances between various people marginalized in the hierarchy. Right. But I also think about assaulting communities that were in some ways more integrated than they will be after those programs, right? And it's a way of sort of controlling the allotment of economic resources for the benefits of certain populations and to the marginalizations of others.
Right.
So when you think about that connected to Wyandotte history in Kansas, how do you see those things connected?
The main difference that I see is when I think of redlining, particularly in the late 19th century, early 20th century, I tend to think of towns, neighborhoods, communities, developments. In the case of the indigenous population, though, you're redlining the entire state. Right. You've got a few locations that are left, but the vast majority by 1870 of Native peoples in this state are gone.
Right.
They have either been classified as white, at which point they are, quote, no longer a threat, or the other thing that happens is they've been forced out. And they've already lost their land, they've lost their economic base. I mean, it's sort of redlining on a much larger scale.
Yes, right, exactly. And I would argue in comparison to redlining as we think of, from like the 1930s on, they're both led by the federal government, right? Like there's certainly support from the population, but the federal government really leads in that kind of segregation.
Federal government leads and state government oftentimes comes right behind it.
Correct, yeah, correct, great. All right, so Anne, do you have other questions?
Yes. Abelard Guthrie seems to be a contentious figure. What are your general thoughts about him?
Abelard is, contentious is a kind word, I think. The reason why Quindaro is named Quindaro is because he essentially uses his wife, Quindaro Nancy Brown, who marries him as Guthrie, to go ahead and to help persuade other members of the Wyandottes to support this movement. Abelard has a lot of chips on his shoulder. He was a land agent, like I said before. His father-in-law hated him enough so that he actually shot at him, which, while there may be some instances where people want to do that, it's very rare that it actually does occur. And in fact, his father-in-law left and went to Canada for a while.
Wow.
And then came back. But Abelard basically he kind of comes across a little bit as somebody who is very good at trying to go after what he wants and what he thinks is best, and not just for everybody else, but especially for himself. Sort of a good example of settler colonialism.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And the speculation that goes on of Wyandotte and other indigenous land in Kansas.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome. Anne, do you have some others?
I think that is the end of the audience questions. Are there any other thoughts or things we want to mention before we wrap up?
Well, when you think about Wyandotte history in Kansas, what do you think is one of the most important things for people to take away about the role of Wyandottes in Kansas history?
I think part of it is you never know who they are. You never know what they're doing, in part because when the government changes classifications, unless you happen to know, you're not going to recognize with names like Walker, Armstrong, Zane.
Mhm.
Names like those are not going to come across as being connected to indigenous people.
Right,
It's not like curly head or porcupine or
Right.
fish or whatever else.
right.
And they have continued to play a role within, they're still active, still here.
Right,
Maybe not in Wyandotte County as much, but they're still around
right.
and are still involved in what goes on in the state. One of the comments that you often hear within indigenous populations is, we've been here 10,000 years, we'll be here 10,000 more.
Right. Absolutely. That's a great way to sort of end our discussion about the Wyandotte in Kansas and the past as prologue. So I want to thank you so much, John, for joining us, for being here today, for coming to talk to us and sharing so much of your knowledge with us. It's always wonderful to talk to you, and I appreciate it so much that you came and joined us today.
Well, thank you all for allowing me to.
And I want to tell everyone that you want to remember to keep an eye out for other programming and other information from the Johnson County Museum. Again, their exhibit on redlining in Johnson County will start in January 2022, and it will go for the entire year for all of 2022. And all different kinds of locations across the metro area are going to have all kinds of programming related to redlining in our community, and how this is something that impacts the history throughout the region, as John has talked to us about. Redlining in indigenous contexts being in state sizes, in reservation sizes, and even, some could argue, the Mississippi River, right?
Right.
So I want to turn that over to Ann, because I know Ann has some programming at the Kansas City, Kansas Public Library. And I also want to say thank you so much to Ann, Kansas City, Kansas Public Library. Wonderful collaboration. I always love working with Ann and her wonderful resources of Kansas history at the library. So Ann, tell us what you've got coming up.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you, John and Ty. This is a wonderful discussion, and I'm so glad that the library could be a part of it as well. But I want to talk a little bit about an event that we have coming up in conjunction with the redlining exhibit in support of that exhibition. I want to invite you all to join us on February 17th for a virtual event at the library. We will be hosting Richard Rothstein for a virtual lecture on his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Mr. Rothstein specializes in the history of segregation in the United States. And in the 6 weeks leading up to the event, the library will hold a Zoom read aloud and community discussion of the book, 2 chapters at a time. So beginning on January 2nd and ending the day before the event on February 16th, Wednesdays at noon is when when the community read aloud and discussion will happen. And if you check kckpl.org, we will have information posted soon about how to register for those events. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.